The sun was a merciless hammer over the Dragoon Mountains, beating down on the cracked earth until the heat shimmered in waves, distorting the horizon. Kale moved with a practiced silence that belied the fire in his right thigh. Each step was a negotiation with pain, a silent bargain he'd been striking for nearly 20 years. He was tracking a small band of mule deer, their tracks faint in the baked soil, but his focus was splintered. Part of him was the hunter, reading the language of the land. The other part was a prisoner, chained to the grotesque swelling that had become the central truth of his life. It had started as a boy's knot, a hard little pebble under the skin that no one thought much of. But it had grown with him, a dark twin feeding on his vitality. Now, it was a gnarled mass, the size of a large fist, bulging unnaturally from his upper leg. It wasn't a soft, fleshy tumor. It was dense and unyielding, its shape vaguely oblong beneath the taut, scarred skin. It made his gait uneven, a subtle but permanent limp that mocked the warrior he was meant to be. The children of his rancheria had long ago stopped asking about it. They simply stared, their innocent curiosity a sharper sting than any adult's pity. He lost the deer. A moment of distraction, a sharp, grinding pulse from the growth, and he'd missed the subtle turn in their path. Frustration, hot and bitter, rose in his throat. He straightened up, tasting the dust in the air, and turned back toward the camp. The walk home was always the hardest part of any journey. It was a slow, deliberate march toward the faces that knew his weakness, that saw not Kale, the son of a respected leader, but Kale, the man with the blighted leg. His wife, Naylin, met him at the entrance to their wickiup. Her eyes, once bright with shared laughter, now held a permanent shadow of concern. She didn't ask about the hunt. She saw the empty hands and the grim set of his jaw. She saw the way he favored his left side as he lowered himself to the sleeping mat. "The pain is worse today," she stated, her voice soft. It was not a question. He grunted, refusing to meet her gaze. "The heat makes it swell." It was the same excuse he always gave, a thin blanket to cover a mountain of agony. He hated the worry in her face because it reflected his own powerlessness. To be a Chiricahua man was to be strong, to provide, to protect. His leg made a mockery of it all. He could still hunt, still fight, but never with the fluid grace of the other warriors. He was always compensating, always fighting a battle on two fronts, one against his enemies, the other against his own body. Later, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Naylin brought him a bowl of stew. She also brought a small clay pot. Taza prepared a new poultice. She says the root is different this time. Kale stared at the pot. Taza, the band's medicine woman, was wise and respected. She had tended to his leg since he was a child, applying poultices of juniper and sage, chanting prayers to Usin, the creator, to draw out the sickness. Nothing had ever worked. The growth remained, hard and indifferent. "It is useless," he said, his voice flat. "Herbs cannot move a mountain." "It is not a mountain, Kale. It is a part of you," Naylin replied, her patience wearing thin. "You must let her try, you must try." He gave a curt nod, more to end the conversation than out of any real hope. After he ate, he hobbled to Taza's wickiup. It sat slightly apart from the others, smoke curling from its apex, carrying the scent of drying herbs and piñon resin. The old woman sat by her fire, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes holding the deep, knowing calm of one who has seen 100 seasons turn. She gestured for him to sit, her gaze already on his leg. "The sun speaks to it," she said, her voice raspy like dry leaves. "It calls to the anger inside." Kale said nothing as he unwrapped the leather bindings that supported his thigh. He exposed the limb. The skin over the lump was discolored. A pale, stretched landscape of faint blue veins and old scars from falls and scrapes. Taza leaned forward, her gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle as they probed the edges of the mass. Her touch sent jolts of dull, aching fire through his nerves. "It is harder than I remember," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "The spirit within it is stubborn. It holds a memory it will not release." She looked up, her dark eyes pinning him. "Did your father ever speak of an injury? A wound from his time fighting the Nakyi?" Never, Kale said. He said this came from a fall from my first pony, a bad bruise that never healed. Taza sat back, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. A bruise is blood. It is soft. It fades. This is stone. It has roots. She began to mix the contents of the clay pot with a little water, creating a thick, dark paste. As she worked, she spoke in a low tone. There are things that enter the body that are not of the body. A splinter from a cursed tree. A stone from an old battleground. A memory of violence that takes root in the flesh. Her words, meant to be wise, felt like accusations. He had always been told it was a simple injury. But the whispers of the camp, the years of failed remedies, had planted a seed of doubt that Taza was now watering. Was he carrying a curse? A physical manifestation of some forgotten dishonor? She applied the poultice. It was cool at first, then began to burn with a clean, sharp heat. As she wrapped it with fresh buckskin, the pressure in his leg seemed to intensify, the deep, internal ache growing into a vicious throb. He thanked her with a nod and left, the pain now so loud it was a roaring in his ears, drowning out the evening sounds of the camp. Back in his wickiup, he lay on his mat, his jaw clenched. Naylin watched him, her face a mask of helpless love. He closed his eyes, but there was no escape. The mass in his leg felt alive, a caged and angry thing, and for the first time he felt it shift, a deep, grinding movement that was not just pain, but a promise of something worse to come. The poultice wasn't healing it. It was waking it up. The fire in Kale's leg had ceased to be a dull, constant ache. Taza's poultice had been a catalyst, turning a smoldering ember into a raging inferno. The pain was no longer just in the flesh and bone. It was a living thing, coiling in his gut, clawing at his throat, and screaming behind his eyes. He lay on the sleeping furs, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ground together. Every rustle of the hide blanket sent a fresh wave of agony through him. The world had shrunk to the confines of his dwelling, to the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs, and to the suffocating presence of his own suffering. Naylin moved silently around the small space, her face a mask of worry etched by the flickering firelight. She offered him water, a cool hand on his feverish brow, but her touch was like lightning on his raw nerves. He flinched away, a guttural sound escaping his lips, a sound of a cornered animal. "Kale, let me get Taza," she pleaded, her voice a low, desperate whisper. "The medicine is not working, it is making it worse." "No," he managed to force the word through his teeth. The shame was as sharp as the pain. To call the medicine woman back would be an admission of weakness, a public display of his inability to endure. He was a Chiricahua warrior. He had been taught to greet pain as an old companion, to bear it with a stoic silence that was its own form of strength. But this was different. This was a devouring entity, and it was winning. He watched Naylin, her love and concern a weight he could not bear. He saw pity in her eyes, and it was more painful than the fire in his thigh. He had to get away. He could not break in front of her. He could not let her see the warrior she married reduced to a whimpering child. Waiting until her back was turned as she stoked the small fire, Kale pushed himself up. The movement sent a blinding, white-hot shockwave from his hip to his ankle. He choked back a cry, his vision swimming with black spots. Leaning heavily on the lodge pole, he stumbled towards the entrance flap, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He had to go, out into the cold, cleansing dark of the desert night. The land had always been his solace. Perhaps its harsh embrace could cauterize this wound from the inside out. Outside, the cold air was a shock, a momentary relief against his burning skin. The Chihuahuan desert night was vast and silent, the sky a blanket of cold, diamond-hard stars. The familiar shapes of the Dragoon Mountains loomed in the distance, their silhouettes a comfort he desperately needed. He limped away from the faint glow of the village, each step a carefully negotiated truce with agony. He didn't have a destination, he just moved, driven by an instinct to hide his torment from the world. He found himself in a small, rocky arroyo, a dry wash carved by summer storms. The sharp edges of the rocks bit into his moccasins, grounding him. He collapsed against a large boulder, the rough stone cool against his back. Here, alone with the wind and the stars, he could finally let go. A low moan escaped his lips, a sound of pure misery that was swallowed by the immense silence of the desert. The mass in his thigh was no longer a part of him. It was a foreign object, a hot, round stone pressing outward, stretching the skin until it was thin and translucent. He could feel it pulsing with a sickening rhythm, a heartbeat of its own that was out of sync with his. The pressure was immense, unbearable. It felt as if his entire leg was about to split open. He clutched it with both hands, his knuckles white, trying to physically hold himself together. His mind began to drift. He was back on the hunt, the deer just out of reach. He saw the faces of the other warriors, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. He saw Taza's troubled eyes, her knowledge failing. He saw Nalan, her love a constant, gentle pressure. The pain blurred these images into a feverish dream. He was losing himself to it, drowning in a sea of fire. Then, the pressure changed. It was no longer a steady, outward force. It was a sharp, tearing sensation. A sound, a wet, sickening rip, echoed in the stillness of the arroyo. Kale screamed, a raw, unrestrained cry of shock and agony that tore from his soul. He fell forward onto the sandy ground, his body convulsing. The blinding, all-consuming pain vanished, replaced by a sudden, shocking release. A warm, wet sensation spread down his leg, soaking his leggings. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing and the thumping of his heart in his ears. The pain was gone, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache and a profound, bone-deep weakness. Fighting a wave of dizziness, he pushed himself up onto his elbows. His vision was blurry, but he forced himself to look down. The poultice was gone, washed away in a mess of blood and a thick, yellowish fluid that stained the dark earth. In the center of his thigh, where the monstrous bulge had been, was a gaping, ragged wound. The skin had torn open. He stared, his mind struggling to process the sight. He expected to see torn muscle, perhaps the white gleam of bone. But in the center of the wound, nestled in the raw flesh, was something else. It was dark, unnatural, and glinted faintly in the moonlight. It wasn't flesh or stone. With a trembling hand, ignoring the searing protest of his torn nerves, he reached down. His fingers brushed against it. It was hard, metallic, and strangely shaped. He hooked his fingernails around its edge and, with a grunt of effort, pulled it free from the suction of the wound. It fell into his palm, heavy and solid. He held it up to the faint starlight. It was a small, flattened piece of lead, a musket ball distorted from impact. His mind went blank. This wasn't a tumor. It wasn't a curse from the spirits or a sickness of the blood. It was a bullet, a memory he did not possess, a wound from a battle he never knew he fought. He stared at the object in his hand, the cold metal a stark, undeniable truth, and the world tilted on its axis. The pain in his leg was nothing compared to the vast, empty chasm that had just opened in his past. The cold of the high desert night was beginning to seep into Kale's bones, a stark contrast to the fire that had just erupted from his thigh. He lay on the rocky ground, gasping, the coppery scent of his own blood thick in the air. In his trembling palm, the misshapen piece of lead felt impossibly heavy, a weight of years, not ounces. The gnawing, deep-seated ache that had been his constant companion since memory began was gone. In its place was a raw, gaping agony, but it was a clean pain, a logical pain. It was the pain of a wound, not a curse. He stared at the lead ball, turning it over and over. A musket ball, flattened by its impact with bone. It was an artifact of a life he couldn't remember, a story told in scar tissue and a forgotten piece of metal. The relief was so profound it was dizzying, but a new feeling quickly took its place. A hollow, echoing void of confusion. Who had done this? When? Why could he not remember the instant his life had been so violently altered? Back in their dwelling, Nalan had woken with a jolt, the space beside her on the sleeping mat cold and empty. A primal fear seized her heart. Kale's groans of pain had been a constant, terrible lullaby for years, but his silence now was infinitely more frightening. She knew the poultice had pushed him to a new edge of suffering. She pictured him wandering into the darkness, driven by a shame she could never fully comprehend, seeking a solitude she could not grant him. Tradition dictated she wait, that a warrior's trials were his own. But Naelin's love for Kale was stronger than any custom. Throwing a heavy bison hide over her shoulders, she snatched a smoldering brand from the central fire pit, its flickering orange light pushing back against the oppressive dark. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to find him. His name was a silent prayer on her lips as she moved past the sleeping dwellings and into the open expanse of the desert. She followed the faint scuff marks of his moccasins in the sand, her eyes scanning the landscape of cacti and creosote bushes. Panic tightened its icy grip around her chest with every step. Then she heard it, a ragged, shallow breath carried on the wind. "Kale," she called out, her voice cracking. She found him slumped against a large boulder, his face pale as bone in the torchlight. Her eyes immediately fell to his leg, to the dark stains soaking through his deerskin leggings and pooling on the ground. A gasp escaped her. For a moment, she feared the worst, that the growth had finally consumed him from within. But then she saw his hand, clenched not in agony, but around a small, dark object. "Naelin," he breathed, his voice a threadbare whisper. He looked up at her, his eyes lucid but exhausted. He opened his hand. "It's over." She knelt beside him, her fear giving way to a surge of focused strength. She saw the gaping wound, the torn flesh, and the object in his palm. She didn't understand what it was, but she understood everything else. He was bleeding, he was weak, and he needed her. "We have to get you back," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She tore a strip of cloth from her own tunic, binding it tightly around his thigh to slow the bleeding. Wrapping his arm over her shoulders, she pulled him to his feet. He leaned on her heavily, his strength almost completely gone, and together they began the slow, agonizing journey back to the village. Their return sent ripples through the awakening camp. Figures emerged from dwellings, their eyes wide at the sight of Kale, half carried by his wife, his leg wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage. The usual whispers of pity and suspicion were replaced by murmurs of shock and alarm. Naelin ignored them all, her focus solely on the door of Taza's dwelling. She pushed through the hide flap without ceremony. "Taza, he needs you." The old healer rose from her sleeping furs, her eyes sharp and immediately assessing the situation. She saw the makeshift bandage, the pallor of Kale's skin. "Bring him here, lay him by the fire." As Naelin gently lowered Kale to the ground, he weakly held out his hand to Taza. This came out. Taza took the piece of lead. She held it close to the firelight, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her breath hitched. The entire demeanor of the medicine woman shifted in that instant. The spiritual healer, the interpreter of omens and herbal remedies for mysterious ailments, vanished. In her place was a woman who had seen the brutalities of battle, who understood physical trauma with a grim clarity. Her eyes, filled with a sudden, terrible understanding, met Kale's. "This is not a curse of the spirits," she said, her voice low and heavy with meaning. "This is the work of men." A lead ball from a white man's rifle. A stunned silence filled the dwelling, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Naelin stared, her mind struggling to connect the ugly piece of metal to the long years of her husband's suffering. Taza wasted no more time on words. She moved with purpose, gathering clean cloths, bowls of water, and jars of potent herbs, not the soothing poultices of before, but astringent plants to cleanse and powders to stop infection. "Naelin, hold him steady. This will not be pleasant." The pain of the cleaning was sharp and searing, but Kale gritted his teeth and bore it. It was a cleansing fire, burning away the last vestiges of the old, insidious ache. Through it all, Naelin held his hand, her presence a solid anchor in his world of pain and confusion. By morning, the story had swept through the entire village. Kale, the man with the shameful lump, the warrior hindered by an unknown affliction, had been shot. The lead ball, now cleaned and sitting on a piece of leather in Taza's lodge, was irrefutable proof. He was not cursed, he was a survivor. The tribe's perception was transforming before his very eyes. Glances of pity were replaced by looks of awe and 1,000 unasked questions. Lying on the mat, His leg throbbing with a clean, healing hurt, Kale felt the weight of his physical burden lift. But a new quest had already settled in its place. He looked at Naelin, whose tireless vigil had saved him, and at the musket ball, a silent testament to a forgotten violence. He had to know. "The elders," he said, his voice stronger now. "I must speak with the elders. Someone must remember." The days that followed were a strange mixture of pain and peace. The sharp, searing agony in Kale's thigh had been replaced by a dull, healing ache, a welcome sensation he hadn't known for most of his life. Taza tended to the wound daily, her hands, once uncertain against the unnatural hardness of the growth, now moved with the quiet confidence of a healer treating a familiar injury. She cleaned the wound with boiled water infused with yucca root and applied fresh poultices of juniper and sage to ward off infection. Each time, she would look at Kale with a new respect, not for his endurance of a curse, but for his survival of an attack. Naelin was a constant, calming presence. She sat with him for hours under the shade of their wickiup, mending moccasins or grinding corn, her silence a comforting blanket. She no longer looked at his leg with pity, but with a shared sense of purpose. The lead ball, cleaned and wrapped in a small piece of deerskin, rested on a ledge inside their home. It was no longer a piece of horror, but a key, cold, heavy, and silent. It was a key to a door in Kale's past he didn't even know existed, and he was determined to turn it. On the 5th day, when he could walk with only a slight limp, Kale knew it was time. The physical wound was closing, but the wound in his memory was wide open. "I must speak to the elders," he told Naelin, his voice steady. "Today." Naelin simply nodded, her eyes reflecting his resolve. Taza, arriving for her morning visit, overheard him. "It is the right thing to do," she said, placing her medicine pouch down. "This is no longer a matter for one man. It is a question for the memory of our people. I will come with you. They will listen to a healer's words." The request for a formal council was sent through a young messenger. The air in the village grew still as word spread. The Council of Elders, led by the wise and deliberate Chief Dasodahi, did not convene for trivial matters. As Kale, flanked by Naelin and Taza, walked toward the large, open-sided ramada where the council met, the daily activities of the village seemed to pause. People watched them pass, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and solemn respect. The man they had once whispered about, as cursed, was now walking to demand answers from their leaders. The elders were already seated in a semicircle on thick woven blankets, their faces weathered maps of seasons and sorrows. Dasodahi sat in the center, his posture erect, his long gray hair tied back with a simple leather band. To his right sat Nakos, an elder so old his skin seemed like thin parchment stretched over bone. He rarely spoke, his eyes often distant, as if watching a world only he could see. Kale, Naelin, and Taza stopped before them, bowing their heads in respect. Dasodahi gestured for them to be seated on a blanket placed for them. The midday sun, filtered through the brush roof of the ramada, cast dappled light on the hard-packed earth. "Kale, son of the people," Dasodahi began, his voice low and resonant, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "You have asked to speak. We have seen your suffering, and we see your recovery. Speak your heart." Kale took a deep breath, the dry desert air filling his lungs. He felt Naelin's hand briefly touch his back, a small anchor of support. "Wise elders," he started, his voice clear and respectful. "For all my life, I have carried a great pain, a burden our people believed was a sickness of the spirit, a curse. I believed it myself." He paused, letting the weight of his past hang in the air. 5 days ago, the Creator saw fit to release me from this prison, but it was not a sickness that left my body. He reached into his pouch and slowly unwrapped the deerskin bundle, revealing the flattened piece of lead. He placed it on the blanket in the center of the circle. The metal was dull, ugly, and undeniably man-made. A collective murmur went through the elders. "This," Kale said, his voice hardening with emotion, "is what I have carried since I was a boy. This is the cause of my pain." Taza leaned forward. "Elders, what Kale says is true. The growth he bore was not flesh of his flesh. It was a pocket of poisoned flesh built around this. This is lead from a white man's rifle. Kale has lived with a gunshot wound for nearly his entire life. The silence that followed was profound. The elders stared at the musket ball, their faces unreadable. Dasodahi leaned closer, his brow furrowed in deep thought. He looked from the lead ball to Kale's face, searching his eyes. A gunshot wound, Dasodahi repeated softly, the words tasting foreign. To a child. I have led this band for 30 winters. I do not remember such an attack. I do not remember a child of our people being shot by the White Eyes and living. He looked at the other elders, who shook their heads in agreement, their faces masks of confusion and denial. An event so terrible would be scarred into our memory. It would be a story told to warn our children. Another elder spoke up, his voice sharp. Perhaps this happened when you wandered from the village as a boy. A lone rider, an accident that was never known to us. Kale felt a chill of frustration. They were not hiding a truth, they genuinely did not remember. The past he sought was not just locked away. It was gone, erased from the collective mind of his tribe. His hope began to crumble. Was this a dead end? A mystery with no one left to solve it? He looked at Nayland, whose face was tight with disappointment. Then his eyes drifted to the end of the semicircle, to the ancient, silent figure of Nakos. While the other elders were leaning forward, discussing, gesturing, Nakos had not moved. He sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the lead ball, but his hands, resting on his knees, were clenched into tight fists, his knuckles white. And in his cloudy eyes there was a flicker, not of confusion, but of a deep, dark, and terrible recognition. Kale's heart hammered in his chest. "Elder Nakos," he said, his voice cutting through the other elders' murmurs. All eyes turned to the old man. Nakos did not look up immediately. He seemed to be pulling himself back from a great distance. Slowly, he raised his head, his ancient eyes finding Kale's. They were filled not with the fog of age, but with a profound and active sorrow. "This piece of metal," Kale pressed, his voice softer now, more pleading. "Does it stir a memory for you, honored one?" Nakos' throat worked, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a dry, rasping whisper, like sand shifting across stone. "Memories are not always stirred," he said, his gaze drifting toward the distant, hazy peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. "Some are buried for a reason." He looked back at Kale, a universe of pain in his eyes. "They are buried under a heavier weight than lead." The air inside the council lodge had grown thin and heavy, suffocating Kale with the weight of unspoken history. As the other elders filed out, their faces impassive masks, Dasodahi gave Kale a final, unreadable look before disappearing into the bright afternoon sun. Only Kale, Nayland, and Taza remained, standing in the center of the circular space, the small, misshapen piece of lead on the hide mat between them feeling heavier than a mountain. "They lie," Kale said, his voice a low growl that vibrated with years of pent-up frustration. "They all lie, or they have chosen to forget." Taza bent down slowly, her old joints creaking, and picked up the musket ball. She rolled it in her palm, her gaze distant. "To forget is a choice, Kale. Sometimes it is a tool for survival. A community, like a person, can only carry so much pain before its back breaks. They chose to straighten up and walk on, even if it meant leaving a part of their story behind in the dust." "But it is my story," Kale insisted, his hand unconsciously moving to the now-healing wound on his thigh. "It has been a part of my body, a poison I did not understand my entire life. I have a right to know its name." Nayland placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch a familiar anchor in the storm of his emotions. "You saw Nakos," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "He did not forget, he is the one who carries it." Kale nodded, his jaw tight. The image of the old man's eyes, a flicker of ancient grief in their depths, was burned into his mind. Buried under a weight heavier than lead. He knows. He holds the key. "Then you must ask him to turn it," Taza said, placing the musket ball back into Kale's hand. "But be careful, my son. Keys unlock doors that have been closed for a reason. You may not like what you find on the other side." Kale closed his fist around the lead. Its deformed shape was a map of a past he couldn't read. "I would rather face a painful truth than live with a comfortable lie." He left the lodge, Nayland at his side, the silence between them full of understanding. He knew a public demand would fail. This had to be a private appeal, one man's pain reaching out to another's. Nakos lived in a small wickiup on the edge of the village, slightly apart from the others, as if he preferred the company of memories to people. Kale found him there, sitting on a worn blanket under the sparse shade of a mesquite tree, meticulously carving a piece of cottonwood root. His hands, though gnarled with age, moved with a steady, practiced grace. He didn't look up as Kale and Nayland approached. Kale stood before him, waiting respectfully. The only sounds were the scrape of Nakos' knife against the wood and the buzz of insects in the dry heat. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, Kale knelt, placing the musket ball on the blanket between them without a word. Nakos' knife stilled. His eyes, clouded with cataracts but still sharp, remained on his carving. "The council has spoken," he said, his voice raspy, like stones grinding together. "The memory is gone." "The memory is not gone," Kale replied, his voice even but firm. "It is hidden. It lives in you, grandfather. I see it." Nakos finally lifted his head, and the weariness Kale saw in his eyes was profound, a chasm of sorrow. "Some things are meant to be hidden. Some wounds, if opened, will bleed the whole village dry. This wound has been bleeding me dry my whole life," Kale said, his control slipping, the emotion raw in his throat. "I was called weak, cursed. The women whispered when I walked by. The other boys outran me, outhunted me. I thought the spirits had marked me for some failing. I spent my nights begging for a reason, for relief from a pain that had no name. Now I have a piece of that reason." He gestured to the lead ball, "But it is not enough. A man must know his own story, grandfather. He must know how he was wounded. Otherwise, the wound never truly heals. It just scars over a poison that remains inside." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a desperate plea. "I am not asking for the tribe. I am not asking to stir up old grief. I am asking for myself. Help me understand the mark I have carried since I was a child. Help me put a face to the shadow that has followed me." Nakos looked from Kale's earnest, pained face to Nayland, who stood silently behind him, a portrait of unwavering support. He saw the strength in her, the resilience that was the hallmark of their people. He saw in Kale not just a warrior demanding answers, but a man trying to piece together his own soul. The old man's shoulders slumped, a lifetime of resolve seeming to crumble. He set his carving and knife aside with a sigh that seemed to come from the very earth beneath them. He stared at the musket ball for a long time. "You think you are strong enough to hear this story?" Nakos asked, his gaze piercing. "You think you can carry this weight once it is passed to you?" "We will carry it together," Nayland said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was quiet but unbreakable. "Our generation is not as fragile as you think, grandfather. We deserve to know who we are, all of it." Nakos' gaze softened. He saw the truth in her words. Perhaps they had carried the silence for too long. Perhaps the weight had become a burden that no longer protected, but instead crushed the spirits of the young who felt its effects without understanding its source. He picked up the lead ball, his thumb tracing its jagged edges. "The truth is not a story to be told in the harsh light of day, amidst the noise of the village. It is a ghost that must be spoken to in the quiet of dusk, when the world is between sleeping and waking." He looked at Kale, his eyes holding a new, solemn promise. "Meet me at the edge of the Talking Canyon when the sun touches the western peaks. Come alone. I will tell you what the elders chose to bury." He held Kale's gaze, a final, somber warning in his voice. "But be prepared. The story does not begin with a musket ball. It begins with fire and with tears." The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the Dragoon Mountains in strokes of orange and deep purple. A cool evening breeze whispered through the grama grass, carrying the scent of dust and creosote. Kale and Nayland met Nakos at the appointed spot, a collection of ancient, silent boulders that stood like sentinels overlooking the valley. The elder was already there, a blanket wrapped around his frail shoulders, his face a mask of solemnity carved by time and memory. He didn't waste time on greetings. He gestured for them to sit, his dark eyes fixed on Kale. "What I am about to tell you," he began, his voice raspy, like stones grinding together, "we did not hide out of malice. We hid it out of shame, and out of a misguided desire to protect a child from a truth we believed would break him." Naylin moved closer to Kale, her hand finding his. His knuckles were white where he gripped his knee. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Nakos closed his eyes for a moment, gathering the threads of a memory deliberately left to fray. "You were very young," he said, his gaze turning inward to the past. "Barely 4 summers. Your father, a strong warrior named Chase, and your mother, the gentle Alezi, were with a small party gathering mescal hearts in the foothills, not far from here. It was supposed to be safe. We had seen no sign of the Nantan Lupan, the soldiers, for many moons." His story began to flow, and the quiet clearing seemed to fade, replaced by the vivid images his words painted. "I was a younger man then, but already a warrior of some standing. I was with the party, as was Taz's father and a few others. The women were laughing as they worked, their hands skilled with the agave. Your mother had a smile that could calm a storm. You were chasing a lizard through the rocks, a small, happy boy with your father's eyes. Chase was watching you, a look of pride on his face. That is the last peaceful memory I have of that day." Nakos paused, swallowing hard. "They came without warning, not from the direction we watched, but from the rocks above us. A volley of rifle fire that echoed like a crack in the sky. It was chaos. Shouts, screams, the smell of black powder and fear. The warriors, your father among them, formed a line instantly, trying to give the women and children time to flee. But we were outnumbered. Their bullets were a storm of lead. I saw Taz's father fall, a look of surprise on his face. Another warrior was struck down beside him. They were not fighting a battle. They were executing an ambush." Kale's breathing grew shallow. He could almost hear the phantom gunshots, feel the panic in the air. The dull ache in his thigh throbbed in time with Nakos' words. "Your mother, Alezi, grabbed you," Nakos continued, his voice thick with unshed tears. "She ran, trying to pull you behind a large boulder. Chase saw her. He saw a soldier take aim at you. He roared, a sound of pure fury, and charged, armed only with his knife. He took down the soldier, but another shot him from the side. He fell, protecting you." Naylin's grip on Kale's hand tightened, her own tears now flowing freely. Kale stared at Nakos, his face pale, his world fracturing and reforming around this terrible new truth. In that same moment of chaos, another bullet ricocheted off the rock your mother was hiding behind. It was a stray shot, a piece of deadly luck. It struck you in the leg. You cried out, a sound a child should never make. Alezi screamed and pulled you tighter, shielding you with her body as the firing continued. I saw it happen. I saw you fall. The rest of us fought back with a fury born of desperation. We managed to drive them off, but the cost was devastating. When the silence returned, it was heavier than the noise had been. We had lost 3 warriors, including your father. Your mother, she was unharmed by the bullets, but her spirit was broken. She held you, trying to soothe you, her face stained with tears and your blood. We brought you all back to the village. Taz's mother, the healer before her, did what she could for your wound. It was deep angry. She cleaned it, packed it with herbs. But the bullet, the piece of lead, it was buried too deep in the muscle and bone. To try and cut it out of a small child would have been to risk your life, to cripple you for good. The decision was made to let it be, to pray the body would heal around it. We did not know, we could not have known it would cause you a lifetime of pain. Nakos finally looked directly at Kale, his eyes filled with a profound, ancient sorrow. We failed that day. We failed to protect our own. The shame was a poison in our community. We buried our dead, and with them, we buried the story. We told ourselves it was for you. We saw you, an orphan whose father died a hero and whose mother faded soon after from a broken heart, and we thought, let him grow strong without this shadow. Let him not know he is the living reminder of our greatest failure. It was the counsel of grieving, ashamed men, a foolish, prideful decision. Over the years, the silence became a habit, then a law. As you grew and the lump in your leg grew with you, we saw it as a curse, because we were cursed by our own memory. We called it a sickness because we were sick with our secret. We were cowards, Kale. We chose the comfort of silence over the difficulty of truth. He reached out a trembling hand and placed it on Kale's shoulder. The projectile you carry is not a mark of a curse. It is the scar of a battle. It is the legacy of your father's sacrifice. It is the proof of your own survival. Forgive us, not for what happened, for that was the work of our enemies, but for the silence. We stole your history from you. For that, I am truly sorry. The sun had vanished completely now, leaving the three of them in the deep blue twilight. The only sound was the wind and the soft, ragged sound of Kale finally letting out the breath he had been holding for a lifetime. The fire crackled, its light dancing across Nakos's weathered face as his story settled into the profound silence of the desert night. The weight of his words pressed down on Kale, a pressure far greater than the growth he had carried for 2 decades. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the echoes of his father's last moments. Naelin's hand found his, her grip firm and grounding. She didn't speak, but her presence was an anchor in the storm of emotions that churned within him. A deep, aching grief for the father he never knew, a surge of pride for the hero he had been, and a cold, quiet anger at the years of silence. He looked down at his thigh. The wound, now bound in clean dressings by Taza, throbbed with a dull, healing ache. For the first time, it was not a source of shame. It was a connection, a final, brutal gift from his father. The musket ball, now safely wrapped in a piece of soft deer hide, felt heavy in his pouch. A physical piece of a history that had been stolen from him. "They let me believe I was cursed," Kale said, his voice low and raspy, the words tearing at his throat. "They let me carry their shame as my own." Nakos bowed his head, the firelight catching the deep lines of sorrow on his face. "Fear is a poison, Kale. It makes cowards of good men. We were afraid of the soldiers returning. We were afraid of the memory, of what our failure to protect our own said about us. And in our fear, we did you a great injustice. We buried the story of a hero and left his son to wander in the dark." That night, sleep offered no refuge. Kale saw flashes of the ambush in his mind, not memories, but haunting images painted by Nakos's words. A strong warrior, Chase, standing defiant against impossible odds. The glint of a soldier's rifle, the sharp cry of a child. He awoke before dawn, the sky a deep indigo, and knew what he had to do. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about restoration. The truth could not remain confined to a fireside confession. It had to be brought into the light for everyone. As the sun cast its first golden rays over the Dragoon Mountains, Kale, with Naelin by his side, walked to the center of the village. He did not go to the council lodge. Instead, he stood in the open, waiting. Soon, Taza joined them, her expression one of grim resolve. Then came Nakos, walking slowly but with a renewed purpose. His presence drew the attention of the villagers, who emerged from their wiki-ups, their curiosity piqued. Finally, the other elders, including the chief, came forward, their faces a mixture of confusion and apprehension. When they were all gathered, Kale spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried with a clarity that commanded attention. "I stand before you today not as Kale, the man with the cursed leg, but as Kale, son of Chase." A murmur went through the crowd. The name was known, but only as one of many lost to time, a name without a story. The elders shifted uncomfortably. Kale unwrapped the flattened musket ball and held it up for all to see. "This was taken from my leg, but it was my father who took the bullet. He died defending his family. He died a warrior, protecting his son." He looked directly at the chief. "For 20 years, his sacrifice was silenced. For 20 years, I carried the pain of this wound without knowing its honor. You told me you did not remember, but Nakos remembered. And now, we will all remember." He did not raise his voice or make accusations. He simply stated the truth, its power more potent than any anger. The chief looked at Nakos, whose steady gaze confirmed every word. The shame on the faces of the other elders was palpable. They had not been malicious, only weak, and the consequence of that weakness stood before them, a living testament to a buried history. The chief, a man whose authority had been built on a foundation of communal trust, finally lowered his head. "You speak the truth, Kale," he said, his voice heavy. "We failed your father in our silence. We failed you. We failed our people by hiding a story of courage behind a wall of our own shame. That ends today." 3 days later, the entire community gathered at the foot of a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley, a place Chase had been fond of. It was not a ceremony of mourning, but of remembrance. Nakos, his voice frail but steady, recounted the full story of the ambush, not as a tale of defeat, but as a story of Chiricahua resilience and the sacrifice of a brave man. Other elders, their memories now unlocked, added details of Chase's skill as a tracker, his laughter, his devotion to his wife and son. They sang the old songs, the ones meant to honor warriors who fall in battle. The melodies, absent for a generation, rose into the vast blue sky, reclaiming a piece of their spirit. As the sun began to set, painting the clouds in hues of orange and purple, Kale stepped forward. He held the lead ball in his palm one last time. It was no longer a burden, but a link in a chain that connected him to his father, his people, and his own identity. He knelt and placed the projectile into a small hole dug in the earth at the base of the overlook. He did not bury it in shame, but planted it like a seed of memory. As he covered it with soil and a small, flat stone, he felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The ache in his heart, the one he had carried longer than the one in his leg, began to dissolve. He had found his father, and in doing so, he had found himself. In the months that followed, the limp that had defined Kale for so long faded, replaced by a confident stride. The scar on his thigh remained, a pale map of his past, but it no longer drew whispers or pity. It drew respect. He was no longer the outcast, but a storyteller, a keeper of a vital part of their history. He would often bring his own son, born the following spring, to the stone marker at the overlook. There, he would tell the boy about his grandfather, Chase, ensuring that the story of his sacrifice would never again be lost to silence. The wound had finally healed, not just in his leg, but in the heart of his people.